பண்ணிய பாவம் எல்லாம் பரிதி முன் பணியை போல நன்னியனின் முன் இங்கு ரசித்திடல் வேண்டும் மன்னா, ரசித்திடல் வேண்டும் மன்னா.
A life without prayer is a life without power. Thank you, Almighty, for blessing us. Moving on with our program, I would like to invite our pillar of strength, our wings of light, and our constant source of motivation, Dr. G. Matilda Bhuvaneshwari, Head and Associate Professor, PG in Research Department of Social Work, to welcome our lovely guest for today.
A pleasant evening, everyone present online, for the national seminar on Life of Women Prisoners during COVID-19. I deem it a privilege to welcome today's chief guest, Dr. Sai Shetty, former Senior Research and Engagement Officer, PAR, and State Coordinator, Angan Trust, Bharatpur, Rajasthan. I welcome you, ma'am. Hearty welcome to our dynamic principal, Dr. V. Sujata, who is the source of inspiration. I welcome ma'am. I welcome Dr. G. Kanaha, Dean of Alumni Relations. Welcome ma'am. I welcome all the faculty members from different parts of our country and all the faculty members from Kaveri College for Women and also faculty members from Department of Social Work. Welcome everyone. I welcome all the students, volunteers of Social Work Department who are present here. Welcome everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm inviting. Next, we have the felicitations by our Madam Principal, Dr. V. Sujata, ma'am. Our principal exhibits exemplary leadership qualities for others to follow. She is an effective leader, and I take it a great pleasure to invite our Madam Principal to facilitate the gathering.
I think ma'am has not joined it. You ask the resource person to speak. I just remind her later. She'll join later. You just ask the resource person.
Seema, next.
Okay.
Yes.
Proceeding with the webinar, it is rightly said that no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones. Now I request our distinguished ma'am, Mrs. S. Hema, Assistant Professor, PG and Research Department of Social Work, to introduce our chief guest to the audience.
Good afternoon. It's my great privilege to introduce our today's chief guest, Dr. Sai Shetty. Madam has been a student of criminology and completed her PhD from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Criminology was one of her interests even as a student. She went on to work as a rapporteur for the Justice Radhakrishnan Committee on prison reforms in Maharashtra. Later, she worked with PAR, Prison Aid and Action Research, based out of Jaipur, which focuses on open prisons. At present, she is working as a state coordinator with Angan Trust on Child Protection. Thank you, ma'am.
I now request the chief guest to take over the session.
Thank you for that. Can that mic be muted, please? Yeah, thank you. Can I share my screen by any chance? Or if the presentation can be put up.
Madam, you can now present your screen.
The presentation is not visible, ma'am.
Uh, is is it now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining, everyone. I think it's a huge crowd, bigger than I expected. I'm quite surprised that close to 100 people are here, 101 to be precise. Anyway, I'll be speaking on life of women prisoners during COVID-19. Um, before I began, I just wanted to, I'm coming back from these physical workshops that we did the entire week. So it's just a little odd to come back to this webinar system where the interactions with the audience becomes quite limited. So before I began, I wanted to get a sense of how many people have been to a prison, as in not really been inside in the sense of an arrest, but um, as a visit, academic exercise, something like that. So Hema was quite helpful with that, and I believe most of the people who are here today have not really seen a prison from inside. And if I directly dive into talking about women prisons during the COVID lockdown, I think that I would do injustice to like the whole issue that we are discussing over here. So I'll briefly take you through what the overview of the presentation is going to be today. I'll be talking about, of course, women prisoners during COVID, but I will build some context to it and just give you some glimpse of what uh, women's lives in prisons are even during non-COVID times, during non-pandemic times, and what are some of the issues and concerns that come up during those times. Because what happens during COVID is an exaggeration of those in the first place. Plus, then there could be some extra needs during the COVID time that we need to address. So we'll begin with some context to what women prisons are like, women prisoners, what's the population, what has been said about issues of women prisoners. Then we get into what was done during COVID, and a lot of this is based on my experience of working with PAR at the time when the first lockdown happened, which was last year. Um, and then what different committees have said, what different states have done. We'll very briefly touch those things, and then we'll focus more on women's lives during the COVID pandemic. And then we'll move to the conclusion about where we head next. And while I do that, I want to end this seminar with two important things. We can't just talk about prisoners without talking about the prison staff. And the women prison staff is also something that we need to focus on. And while we focus on the prison staff, I will end this webinar with a brief discussion about what social workers can do in women prisons. Because we're doing this with the School of Social Work, this becomes very relevant, and I would love to end my presentation with a brief discussion about what social workers can do in women prisons. So I'll just dive into the presentation now. Um, when we talk about the prison population, there are two important statistics that we need to take into consideration. One, I believe, is important across. That is the number of under trial prisoners we have. And we've always had about 65 to 70% across states, okay? Population in prisons that has been under trials. What that essentially means is these are people who have not been punished. These are people who've been arrested, have been sent to judicial custody, or have trials going on, and their punishments have not, their guilt, in fact, has not been decided yet. So whenever we are looking at the prison population, this is an important issue because the huge amount, the number of under trial prisoners that we have in prisons across the country affects pretty much every facility that is provided to prisoners. and every facility that needs to be provided to them as a right. And the second statistic that is on the presentation over here is, and that is relevant to our discussion today, and that is the number of women prisoners we have in prisons in India. And this statistic that you see in the first line is from 2019. A great place to get prison statistics is the National Crime Records Bureau website that publishes the Prison in India report every year. The latest being the 2019 one, from where I could get this statistic, that only 4.13% of the total prison population is women prisoners. And I'll get back to this statistic every now and then, because again, these are some numbers that affect how we treat women inside prisons. So it's a very minuscule percentage if you see that way, where close to 45 some percent of the population in the country is women. The prison population is minuscule that way. What happens because of this is women prisoners are kept in select few prisons. Every state would have some prisons that are exclusively for women, and then there would be some where a few barracks are designated for women prisoners. Because they constitute such a small population, the kind of attention that women prisoners is given in general, okay, COVID times, non-COVID times, whenever, is very minimal. And that then affects their lives inside prisons. This is something that even the Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer committee found, which was set up in, I believe, 1980 somewhere. They submitted the report in 1987, hence the date over there. And they realized that because of this small population, and this population, by the way, has been around 4-5-ish percentage only. There hasn't been like a major growth or fall in the women population of women prisoners. So what they found is, because of such a small population, everything that they get sort of gets ignored. And this is not intentionally ignored, but the larger focus continues to remain on the 95-96% that is out there. So say vocational training is not provided to them as it would be provided. So when prison industry started coming up gradually, we realized that women prisoners were given like menial work, kitchen work, unpaid work, but there wasn't any systematic prison industry that came up for women prisoners. A lot of times their health needs get ignored. A lot of times, and I'll get into some specific examples also when I move on, a lot of times even the prison manuals, basically the rules and regulations of how a prison is run, have had like 2 and 5 sheets in like a huge pile of 400 pages dedicated to women prisoners. So that is the kind of attention women prisoners have gotten. So this is something that came out when Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer submitted their report. So he's specifically talking about the need for efficient treatment programs. And when he says treatment programs, he's talking about basically rehabilitation, vocational training, education programs, those kind of things. So, which are not provided as per the requirement. Then he realized that because of these things, the women somehow were a little underprivileged in the prison as compared to the male counterparts. And one of the suggestions that he made was to give women work, because establishing a big industry for, say, if there are only 90 women prisoners in a particular prison, establishing some larger rehabilitation program might not be feasible. But what he suggested was then they could be assigned to smaller components of the larger industry that would be next door in the male prisons. So, so these were some of the things that came up in the Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer committee report. There was a more recent study by the Ministry of Women and Child Development in 2018, and this is in the context of a very landmark case which is ongoing, which is the 1382 prisons case in short, where a retired Supreme Court judge wrote to the sitting Chief Justice at that time about the poor condition in 1382 prisons, hence the title. And then this case took up various issues across prisons across the country, from under trials to women prisons to juveniles in prisons to health facilities, everything under the sun that affects the prison system. So in this recent study also, what they found was that some of the medical facilities that are provided are below par. To give you specific examples, a gynecologist or a pediatrician might not always be present, will have to be on call. Women might have to visit the local government hospital to visit a gynecologist. So these kind of things came up. Then the vocational training issue continues. If you see the date of that report, Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, it's 1987, but we continue to face this problem where we still don't have proper vocational training and rehabilitation programs for women prisoners. And this is even in central prisons, which are like the bigger prisons. So this is something that came up again in the study that MWCD did recently. One other issue that came up is the contact that the women prisoners have with their families, and more specifically the children in either outside or within the prison. So across the country, I'll just give some more context. Every state has their separate prison rules, and in each state, I would say children till about 5 or 6 years, usually 6 years, are allowed to stay with the mothers in the prison if that's a facility that's available. And older children than 6 would then, if they don't have any other guardians, would be institutionalized or would stay with whatever other family members that are available. So that's what it is. What this study, the 2018 study, found out was the issues concerning the contact that children who lived outside had, and how infrequent that was, and various factors that affected that contact, which I'll discuss in a little more detail because COVID affected this even further. Coming to an important contribution, there was this case a few years back called the R.D. Upadhyay versus State of Andhra Pradesh, where the issue of women prisoners was taken up. And a few years after this, I was working with the Justice Radhakrishnan Committee on Prison Reforms in Maharashtra, and I was going through the prison manual for Maharashtra state. And what I found out was that women prisons had, I believe, 4 or 5 pages dedicated to it, while everything else was about prisons in general. And the only few facilities that the prison manual at that time, of course, this manual has been, there have been changes in that manual since then. At that time was about providing coconut water and some carbolic soap for women who had recently delivered in prisons, and like some minor changes in the kind of meals that are provided to pregnant women prisoners. But what R.D. Upadhyay did was laid down these very detailed guidelines of what all should be provided to children of who are living with women prisoners, pregnant women prisoners, and newborn babies. So it gave like not just their dietary requirements, but also the other stuff that they might require for that might aid their development and growth. Because what we need to understand is, even if the mothers are in prisons, the children are normal citizens. Children are not convicted for any crime. They haven't committed any crime, but unfortunately, they've ended up living in prisons in those years. A more recent study and something that focused on COVID-19 was a study by Prayas. Prayas is a field action project by Tata Institute of Social Sciences that focuses on prisoners and women institutionalized in other care institutions. So they did a study where they interviewed about 500 people on how their lives, this was a rapid assessment study, hence the number is 500. So how COVID had impacted.
Dr. Sai Shetty, sorry for
Yeah.
the interruption. The slide is not moving.
The slide will move. I am still on the first one.
Is it okay? Okay,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. So this study, which is the last one mentioned on the slide that we are on, which interviewed 500 people. About 50% of these were women respondents, and a huge population of that was people who had been released from prison. Now, this could have been on bail. This could have been after finishing their sentences, but the release was during the lockdown, the COVID affected lockdown. And what the study found out that women who had been released had a far more difficult time getting jobs or even maintaining the jobs they had uh, during the lockdown. And then there was that additional risk of them uh, being driven into destitution, sexual exploitation, taking up illegal activities, and then you can imagine the cycle that we're getting into or pushing the women into. So this is basically the context of what women prisoners or institutionalized women look like. There's another point that I want to mention over here, and that becomes relevant again in the COVID context, is if you see this slide, the lack of legal awareness and access to justice. Another landmark study by this woman named Smita Chakrabarti, who is the founder of PAR, found out that so her study has been restricted to prisons in Rajasthan, but what she found out is that a lot of times the women who are inside prisons depend on their guardians, which could be husbands, fathers, male family members, basically, for any kind of legal awareness or accessing a lawyer, hiring a lawyer, knowing what is happening in their case, etc., etc. And so what happens for women prisoners in particular, and especially if they're illiterate, is that they don't know where their cases are, what's happening with their case, what is the next step, what to do next. So that's another issue that I have not covered in the previous slide that I just want to briefly touch upon. And we'll see how all of these issues that I mentioned sort of get even more severe when we get into the lockdown, or when we are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. Moving on, let's now dive into the COVID issue. So what happened in prisons during COVID-19? So last year, what happened when the first wave hit was the Supreme Court in mid-March only took cognizance of the issue of COVID in prisons. At that time, there weren't too many cases of COVID in prisons, but this was sort of before anything came up. And I was in Rajasthan at that time, and there were no cases in Rajasthan in prisons at that time. In fact, there weren't any cases for 2 months since that time. So in March 2020, the Supreme Court took cognizance in this case called contagion of COVID-19 virus in prisons. I've given the case number also in case somebody wants to go back, read about the orders at that time. So what they essentially did was, and it's a known fact that prisons have been overcrowded across the country. And at that time, I believe the overcrowding was like 117, 18%, something like that, around that number. So now, all of us know that one of the requirements when the lockdown hit was for us to maintain 2 feet of physical distance from each other. And then let's look at prisons, where going by the understanding that most of us have not seen prisons from inside, what prisoners essentially get is some bedding, which is rolled and unrolled every day. They'll sleep on the floor. This will include a blanket, not necessarily a mattress, but something that they can use as a mattress, which is, say, 2 feet in breadth. Very often in an overcrowded barrack, you will see these mattresses or these sleeping bed sheets, whatever they are, aligned one after the other, and there will be some space like to walk between these, but not necessarily enough to maintain whatever physical distancing requirements are there. So because of that, what the Supreme Court ordered was for the release of prisoners, and it set a certain criteria for release, and it left it to the states to actually release the prisoners. So different states started releasing different number of prisoners based on whatever guidelines the Supreme Court had given. One of the things that the states were considering based on Supreme Court's orders was looking at prisoners who had been either who were under trials or had been convicted for crimes where the punishment was less than 7 years. So that is how they started releasing. But an important point over here that we need to understand is that the Supreme Court gave these guidelines. The Supreme Court said that high-powered committees have to be formed in every state for release of prisoners, because we can't afford to live in that kind of an arrangement where we can't maintain that 2 feet of physical distancing that is required. What the high-powered committees, which were headed by a sitting High Court judge, did essentially was then directed the courts who were dealing with bail cases, or the prison department that was dealing with release of parole cases, to start releasing the prisoners. But what happens in such a situation is that this kind of a judicial order, this kind of a order can't really overpower the judicial process that is followed. So they could only give these guidelines, but what we realize, and a lot of organizations working with prisoners, male prisoners as well as female prisoners, realized is that for the actual release to happen, there were like a different set of hurdles, and the prisoners, because of the overcrowding, continued to be at risk of contacting COVID. And if you read through some of the newspaper articles during even the first or the second lockdown, there are high profile prisoners who've gotten COVID. We recently also a couple of weeks back found out about Stan Swami, who was in one of the prisons in Maharashtra, who passed away after COVID related complications. A lot of prisoners did get COVID even after these release orders. And I'll tell you some of the barriers that came over here. Some of the general barriers that came over here was that immediately after the lockdown, what happened is the number of courts that were functioning came down. A lot of the hearings, the courts were only hearing absolutely essential matters. In Rajasthan specifically, where I was, the courts, there was a day or two where one of the High Court judges said that bail matters were not absolutely essential. So all of these people who then had to petition to the High Court or to any court for release on bail could not do it. But fortunately, this order was reversed by the Supreme Court. But some of these kind of issues came up. Then some issues that anyway come up during bail is people don't have sureties, people don't have money to give personal bonds. So some of these continue to happen. Sometimes identity documents are not there with the prisoners, so they might be getting bail on paper, but the actual release from prison did not happen as much as was promised or expected. So I remember Uttar Pradesh saying that they'll release 11,000 prisoners. I think a state said they'll release 10,000 prisoners. But actual release, there's a good study by Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative that looks at what the actual release was. And the actual release was much lower than these promised numbers of 10,000, 11,000 and whatever thousand that was promised. And that is because identity documents were not present in whatever I just mentioned. So those were some of the barriers in the release. Another barrier now that is specific to the female prisoners that we're talking about, and if you refer to the last point that I made on the previous slide, was that their lack of legal awareness. And this affects their access. So if they don't know that the Supreme Court has passed such a judgment, and if they're not in touch with their lawyers, if their family isn't as proactive, they will not know that they have to apply for bail under the Supreme Court order, or that they need to approach their lawyer. So that's something that really affects female prisoners and has heavily affected female prisoners. While we're talking about COVID, I want to just sort of narrow down my discussion to some of my own experiences of working with the Rajasthan prison department at the time. What the Rajasthan prisons had done was once cases. So now the Supreme Court order happened in March 2020. Rajasthan's first COVID cases in prisons were in May 2020. So what they did at that time was then started establishing isolation and quarantine wards where people who were being arrested and sent to judicial custody were kept for a few weeks, 2 weeks that was required, the 14 days quarantine. And then they would be, if they did not show any symptoms and after their RT-PCR tests were done, would be sent to the rest of the prison. So they started establishing these spaces for isolation, and a lot of times wherever available, the female barracks or the female prisons were used for this isolation, and the women prisoners during that time were either from like 2-3 prisons pulled together into one prison or moved to a barrack in the male prison. Now there were cases during the transportation of prisoners catching COVID. So this is another thing that came up. Although the intention was good, probably the right amount of care was not taken during that time. The organization I worked with, Prison Aid and Action Research, we were appointed to do this quick short study on what the health and sanitation condition or preparedness of the prison was at that time with regards to COVID. And we were asked to collect data from every prison. So the state and taluka, the state district and taluka legal services authority helped us with getting this data. Interestingly, what happened, and we come back to like the women prisoners being only a 4% population and being ignored that I've been discussing. Interestingly, what happened is we got responses from all the central and district prisons and sub jails, but we did not get a response from more than, I think, 1 or 2 women prisons out of about 9 that are there in Rajasthan. So it was as if the issue of women inside prisons and what was happening during COVID was just not something that the prison department registered and thought it was necessary to respond to. Yeah, and then there was this picture of women prisoners or women prisons being handled quite well because they are usually not as overcrowded as the male prisons. There was this perception that all was well. But I'll tell you one interesting thing. There was in the second lockdown around April of 2021, and I come to a Tihar example now. Tihar is the Delhi Central Prison, famously known as Tihar. So what happened over there is there was a point when the highest number of COVID cases were not from any overcrowded prison, but an undercrowded women's prison over there. There were about 40 something cases from there, and the second highest number of cases were from another male prison, which was 30 something. And the DG was asked about why such a thing had happened. There was no response to that. So coming back to that point of women prisons being ignored so often, that in managing the COVID situation in these other prisons, the departments sometimes have not realized that women prisons also need to be paid attention to, and there can be a risk. And now, why is COVID a risk even when women prisons are underoccupied? Coming back to giving you some context about how prisons function. Of course, they have these huge walls, and it appears like they are disconnected from the outside world. And in many ways, they definitely are disconnected from the outside world. For anybody to visit or even to meet somebody in the prison is a long process, a difficult process sometimes. But there are people living inside prisons, and they need food, and they need some basic health and sanitation facilities. They need their garbage to be picked up, etc., etc. So even when there is COVID, some of these things, there is an in and out of people from prisons, and that poses, and that will always pose a risk of taking viruses inside the prison, even if you isolate completely. What also happened during COVID was the mulakats or the meetings between prisoners and families stop. So even if those were stopped, some of these essential services had to reach there. There is this entire prison staff that lives outside somewhere, interacts with people outside, goes to the prison for their duty, comes out. Medical staff that goes in and out. And that continues to be a risk for COVID in prisons. And hence, there's a good possibility that this Tihar case was through somebody who was doing this in and out. Which got completely ignored in our idea of women prisons are under-occupied. We can maintain physical distance, so we don't need to worry too much about it. Next, we move into specifically what happened in two women prisoners or in women prisons during COVID. Now, like I mentioned, children till about age 6 are allowed to stay with their mothers if they are incarcerated. If they are older, they either live with other family members, guardians, or they live in institutions. So one thing that essentially happened during COVID was that prison visits changed. Prison visits went from physical meetings. Physical meetings would also not be like physically being able to touch people, but there is usually a mesh or some glass sort of a partition where prisoners can meet. But the regularity of these went down further during COVID times. And a lot of the meetings between the children or the family members and women prisoners became over the phone, over video calls, or over phone calls. I'm not going to go through the first 2 points because I believe I've covered that. So one of the findings from an earlier study by this organization called Prayas, which I mentioned earlier, was that children who lived outside of prisons when their mothers were incarcerated were anyway not able to meet their mothers quite frequently. And whatever our judgment about women being behind bars is, there is a good possibility some of them are under trials. And I mean, there could be various reasons why they are inside. But what is essential for child development that we know is further contact between mother and child. One is that they are children, so they may not necessarily know the legal process of what one has to do to meet their parents or guardians inside a prison. They might not have adult members available who can guide them through that process. If they are institutionalized, then they could be institutionalized in some other district and their mothers are in prison in some other district. So that meeting might not happen. So even during non-COVID times, these meetings between children and women prisoners had been infrequent. And then COVID adds to the barrier of being able to move, being able to take transport, etc., and reach their mother in prison. So prison visits changed. Women prisoners could not meet their family members as frequently. Another important finding, not necessarily from a study, but it's more of an experiential thing, is a lot of times women prisoners tend to lose contact with their families sooner than their male counterparts. And there are various social reasons for that. I won't delve too much into that because I might run out of time if we get to discussing that. But so they tend to lose contact with their family members, so they might not have these family members. And these kind of issues, like I said, keep getting exaggerated when there is COVID. They could be in another district and the family is in another district, so getting in touch becomes difficult. There's a good possibility that with the female prisoner, the male, her husband, some other family member could also be incarcerated, hence that loss of contact. But some of these contacts are possible to be maintained during non-COVID times. Those definitely changed. Then I come to the issue of transportation during COVID-19. Like we were discussing the Supreme Court case, there were a lot of people. That point should have been transportation during COVID-19 rather than being the other way around. Anyway, like we were discussing that the Supreme Court ordered for the release of a certain number of prisoners. A barrier that was also seen was the lack of transportation. If you remember the first lockdown, literally everything suddenly came to a standstill. People outside also couldn't grapple with what was happening. I remember being in Jaipur at that time and not knowing what was happening. I mean, we were also confused. A lot of prisoners who were released during that time had no transportation. They had no money for transportation because they're being released from a prison where they have anyway limited whatever resources. Uh, Once the prison department started realizing that such a thing was happening, then there were these provisions to drop them at state borders or to drop them at district borders, etc., etc. But there was this good amount of time where prisoners could not figure out how to get back home even if they were released. A lot of organizations I know stepped up during this time to provide for this transportation fund. Um, Coming to the next point, and I think I've covered this, so I won't go back into covering this. Can prisons really be isolated? So even if to prevent COVID from entering the prisons, the idea might have been to stop mulaqats. Like I mentioned, there are so many services that are required inside a prison every day that you can't really stop people from coming in and out of prisons. The prison staff themselves will have to travel in and out. These were some of the issues that women prisoners faced during the lockdown. Some issues that they already faced got exaggerated because of COVID and because of the lockdown. If you remember, I briefly mentioned that there is a lack of doctors and health facilities even during regular times in prisons. And this got exaggerated during COVID, and not just for female prisoners, but even for male prisoners, where there was this added burden on whatever uh, was available. Right now, we are focusing on vaccinating the prison population. Again, I mean, that is a Herculean task that the state has undertaken in recent days, close to the second lockdown. So then where do we go from here? And I've come towards the end of my presentation. And I've titled this Finding a Space for a reason that all my discussion um, has focused on how women prisoners and women prisons are receiving so little attention. So what essentially I think needs to happen is for women prisons to find their space in the larger policy discussions. Right from how many pages they occupy in the prison manual to how much space they occupy in prisons, in vocational courses, in education courses, in prison industries, etc., etc., so on and so forth. So what's important is for women prisoners and women in prisons to be visible when policies are being laid down. The Model Prison Manual of 2016, which is something that various states are in the process of adopting, uh, has a complete chapter on women prisoners. And that's something that is really the need of the hour right now. There needs to be a section that is dedicated to children of women prisoners, which is something that is also there in the R.D. Upadhyay judgment that I mentioned earlier, and also the Model Prison Manual. But women prisoners need to be visible in any kind of policy discussion around prisons. Um, Vocational courses. What happens quite often is, say, take the example of some central prison where the male prison would be one section and the female prison would be one tiny bit of it. There would be like 100, 120 women over there, or maybe sometimes even less. So compared to a population, say, of 2,000 male prisoners, this is a minuscule population, and hence vocational courses very often focus on what is happening in the male prisons. If you have, say, 100 women in the female section, some could be older than capable or interested in vocational courses. So when you start deleting that kind of population, some might not have the basic education to participate in a vocational course or whatever minimal requirements are there. And so the population that becomes eligible for any kind of course becomes minuscule, and hence they get very often they get ignored again. I mean, this is going to be the theme of our discussion, that how ignored women prisoners have been and continue to be. So what we need is for interventions that focus on female prisoners only, or focus on female prisons only. Then what needs to happen, there's a lot of reform that is required in how female prisoners can continue to maintain contact with children and family. Like I said in during my presentation, that female prisoners very often tend to lose contact with their family members sooner than the male counterparts. One of the reasons for this is once the woman is incarcerated, and a lot of times female prisoners who are incarcerated for serious offenses are for the murder of somebody in the family only. There's that stigma that is attached to their crime, which is far more than that is attached to to male, their male counterparts. So female prisoners face that extra stigma. Female prisoners also usually, and I mean this is the case across the country, where women don't tend to have the uh, same land holdings as their male counterparts. So essentially, when they get incarcerated, there isn't much that the family can get out of them. Their unpaid care labor of taking care of children or older people is taken up by somebody else who's outside the prison. So there are these various reasons why they lose contact with their families, where the families don't really see a point in being in touch. And I wouldn't blame the families. I mean, that's how the society is structured. So many times the female prisoners can be in another district, because there are so few female prisoners, and there are very few prisons that are exclusively dedicated to women prisoners. They tend to be in locations where there are central prisons. So they could be in some other district, and the family finds it difficult to meet the female prisoner. So that's another reason why they tend to lose contact. So what the state or what the prison departments need to do is to make sure that that contact is not broken, devise ways in which that contact can be maintained. There's an interesting scheme in Maharashtra where the prison department allows for physical meetings with children and parents in the prison, where they can actually, without any mesh or a barrier, sit with each other and maybe like spend an evening together or spend an afternoon together. Um, so something like that, where it will also help maintain the mental health of female prisoners, maintain that contact, maintain that social contact. So those kind of things are something that are required. That then comes to or contributes to the rehabilitation services or the rehabilitation of female prisoners in general. If they lose contact with their family, imagine after their release, they will have nowhere to go to. So there needs to be vocational courses, there need to be that contact with the family, which can then facilitate their rehabilitation. What also happens with female prisoners very often is that they um, not just lose contact with their family, but also lose the property. So imagine a woman being arrested from her house. She has maybe her identity document, some other essentials at home. She has her jewelry, which is an asset that women in our country usually have. They might not have land in their name, but they have jewelry that they hold on to, which becomes their fallback or social security in a sense. So they lose that jewelry because there's nobody who's a guardian left behind in that house who will take care of it. There could be so many reasons why when she is released, she will not have access to that jewelry uh, that she's leaving behind in the house during her arrest. So that's something that needs to be focused on, and all of these things, these are not COVID specific issues that I'm talking about in finding a space, but all of these issues are going to contribute to how female prisons deal with COVID also, because that contact with the family is something that is absolutely essential. if there are good vocational courses, and if there are good rehabilitation programs, and there is a time when we need to release prisoners during, say, a third wave or something, then women who are being released will have options to fall back on. They will have jobs that they can find. That's something that the Prayas study found out, that only 8% of women who were being released from institutions had a job to keep or had work. So yeah. Moving on from discussing female prisoners to discussing some people who keep the prisons working the way they work, is the female staff. Like the issue of women prisoners gets ignored, the issues of women prison staff also very often gets ignored, and I wouldn't want to leave them out of this discussion. There are sometimes there are prisons that are in the outskirts of the city where female staff doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the transportation available to reach their place of duty. Not all of them can get housing right next to the prison. Some of them might have families, husbands who work in the city while they work in these prisons on the outskirts. So that's something that, again, very often is not taken into consideration when prisons are constructed outside the bounds of the cities or smaller towns also. Female staff quarters is something that is ignored. Female staff remunerations are something that are ignored so often. So if we need to improve the condition of women prisoners and the condition of women prisons, we also need to improve the condition simultaneously of the prison staff that works there. They need to be given facilities. Sometimes basic facilities of toilets are not available. Clean toilets, rather. Toilets could be available, clean toilets, clean hygiene and sanitation facilities, breastfeeding rooms, etc., etc. All of these things are not taken into consideration when we are thinking of prison architecture. So some of these things need to be taken care of, and these also become important for women who live inside prisons. And finally, I would want to end with a brief discussion about what social workers can do. I think social workers can hugely contribute to how female prisoners are able to maintain contact with their children and family. Especially during COVID times, there have been organizations essentially full of social workers that have contributed to not just the contact, facilitating the transportation that I just mentioned, that there was a lack of transportation. So facilitating transportation, making sure that the women prisoners are in touch with their children. The children know where their mothers are. Social workers can contribute to policy by creating spaces where some of these issues of women prisoners are discussed, be it in social work forums or be it with whatever interactions that social work institutions have with the government. So there's a lot that the social workers can contribute to, because not every requirement of women prisoners is legal. Right? There is so much more that they need beyond legal aid and legal representation, for which social workers can contribute to. Social workers can also contribute to life skills or development, to vocational training, to some programs for children of women prisoners inside the prison. I mean, if we get into interventions that are possible, then there is so much that the social workers can do. And I would just want to end on this note that there is so much work that needs to be done for women in prisons, for female prisons. And I just hope this discussion can give some direction, or like can at least instill some sort of inspiration to work with female prisoners. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone here today, I'd like to thank our chief guest, Dr. Sai Shetty, for her eloquent speech and sharing with us her thoughts and experience and enlightening us. We got more insight on the life of women prisoners and staff, especially during this pandemic, and the difficulties they face, and what we as social workers can do.
But of being successful, it's about asking questions and listening to the answer. It's time to hear questions from you all in this session. Participants are requested to raise your questions in the chat box.
I just want to say that I would be open to taking questions even beyond what was presented over here.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Dr. Matilda. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Ma'am, can you tell us something about open prisons in Rajasthan?
Yeah. While I was working on while I was working with Prison Aid and Action Research, PAR, our larger focus was on open prisons. Open prisons are something that are minimal security prisons. So, in a closed prison where the prisoners leave the prison premises only if they have to go to the hospital or the court, in an open prison, prisoners very often leave the prison premises even for work. So they can have jobs that are outside of the prison that they have to report to every day, come back. Uh, in an open prison, it's a system of self-discipline. So there'll be a prison panchayat that looks after the attendance. Of course, there'll be minimal prison staff that is stationed at an open prison, but there'll be prisoners who go out in the morning, come back in the evening for their attendance, and during the during the day they'll have different work that they do. And if I can give you some example from my experience in Rajasthan only, there are prisoners who are auto rickshaw drivers during the day. There are prisoners who have like these idli stalls. There are prisoners who run their own shops. It could be clothes store. There are prisoners who work as security guards also during the day and then come back in the evening. And it's quite an interesting profession, that of a security guard. Imagine somebody who's incarcerated for a crime being the security guard somewhere. But what we've understood and why open prisons work is because most of the people in prison um, have committed that crime in that momentary lapse of judgment, and they are not what one can call hardened criminals. Uh, and a lot of them need that second chance, need to have that opportunity to reform, rehabilitate, and get back into the society. And open prisons are a really good medium to do that. That's essentially what open prisons are, where prisoners can also live with their families. They will not live in a typical barrack-like setup, but they will have small houses. Uh, of, of course, these houses would be like two-room houses where they can live with their families, they can live with their children. Open prisons have seen to also help with the reintegration of prisoners back to the society. So yeah, that's what open prisons are.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, do we have open prisons for the women?
I think that's a really good question. Uh, we don't have separate open prisons for women, but in some of the larger open prisons across the country, there are women prisoners also. What we also have had in the past is that sometimes open prison rules of particular states have not allowed for women prisoners to be sent to open prisons, but fortunately that is changing for the better, and we do see women prisoners also living in open prisons.
Thank you, ma'am.
There's somebody who's asking for me to tell about the challenges by social workers. I'm assuming this is in the context of working in prisons only. And I think I'll start with the challenge, which is something that came up during the COVID lockdown. Uh, I remember having these meetings of organizations that work with people in prisons, where after the lockdown, prison visits were restricted, like I mentioned. So, not just the family, but even the social workers who visit the prisons, uh, they could not visit the prisons. And so that was one challenge that came up for social workers during the COVID times, where they could not keep in touch with their clients. It could be people inside prison, or it could be their family members outside the prison also. So that's one challenge, and there really wasn't a straight solution for that challenge that came up during COVID time. Uh, Another challenge that social workers sometimes face in the prison is because of the nature of the institution, that the prison is a very closed, guarded sort of an institution. Finding that space inside prison can be a little tricky or a little difficult. But having said that, it's not like people have not been able to do it. There are very good initiatives where people have found that space inside the prison, have found that recognition by the prison department to do different kinds of work that they do. A more practical or a logistical challenge that sometimes social workers face is tracing families and tracing children, where at the time of arrest, the arrests of people very often happen in a very hurried way. And then, say for example, your child has gone to school and you're getting arrested, and imagine you being like an illiterate woman somewhere in the country. When she gets arrested and goes to the police station, she doesn't know whether her child has come back home, or who's taking care of the child. So these kind of issues get exaggerated, and then it becomes a social worker's job to sort of find out, trace the child. Sometimes these children immediately get institutionalized, so the social workers have to figure out which institution the children have been kept in. So these are some of the challenges that social workers face while working in prisons.
Good evening, ma'am. Just a small query like which type of prisoners are admitted in open prison?
So across the country, like I said, different states have different prison manuals, but more or less the prisoners who get transferred to open prisons would be people who have served a substantial sentence in a regular closed prison. And because of the nature of the open prisons, or the number of open prisons we have, very often in practice these end up being people who have long sentences and who served, say, anywhere between 8 to 10 years in a closed prison, and then get transferred to an open prison. So you'll be surprised, a lot of the people in open prisons are actually people convicted for murder, because these are the ones who have the longest sentences.
Okay, ma'am. And the last one is that what are the best practices that has been carried out in prison? I mean, like best practices in India, which prison has carried out? Like which model, on based on what model they have been practicing and how they are the best?
I don't think I can pick one prison that way. I think different states have done really interesting work. But I'll give you some examples. Like if you look at the whole concept of open prisons, I think Rajasthan as a state has been doing really well. They've been able to sustain this model of open prisons, and that has worked well for reintegration of prisoners to the society. There was another scheme that I mentioned, the Garabhet scheme in Maharashtra has had really good results, where some of these prisoners get to physically meet their children till the age of 16. I believe that's the GR 16 or 18, I'm not very sure. Um, so they get to physically meet their children, and that really has worked well for the mental health of prisoners because uh, you know meeting twice a month with that partition in between is not uh, an ideal way of meeting their children. So the grab scheme has worked wonders for the mental health of prisoners that the Maharashtra prison has. There are these vocational training courses that something that Kiran Bedi rose to fame with. When a lot of limelight was on Tihar and the vocational training courses in Tihar, maybe like a decade or two back. So that's another thing that has worked really well for the rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners. So there are these different things that different prison departments are doing, which are working wonders.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Participants, do you have any other questions?
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Renita. I'm a research scholar in social work. So, can you share some experience if you have with women in probation, women probationers who are facing challenges in social reintegration?
Um, Women probation. You mean to say women who've been released on probation?
Yes, 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 ma'am.
Uh, that is something I don't have a lot of experience on, so I wouldn't want to like make any wrong comments. But Probation of Offenders Act in general, as an act, has been quite poorly implemented across the country for various reasons. And I can give you an example from Maharashtra, where the Department of Probation actually comes under the Department of Women and Child Development, and hence the people who get appointed as probation officers to work with prisoners are sort of on temporary posting to prisons rather than being permanent staff that works with prisoners, and that then affects the implementation of the Probation of Offenders Act. Also, another thing that I can tell you from my reading and not really practical experience is um, Prayas works a lot on the issue of probation. Basically, based on some of my interactions with Prayas, has been that a lot of these trial court judges are not necessarily aware of the Probation of Offenders Act, or don't implement or don't think of the Probation of Offenders Act when they are deciding on a sentence or even later. And so that again affects the implementation of the Probation of Offenders Act and the whole concept of probation.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I believe there was somebody who had raised their hand, and I don't know how to find that.
No, ma'am, by mistakenly he did, I think.
Okay, okay.
Good evening, ma'am. I would like to know about the stigma attached to the women prisoners after release. So, is there
Right.
any follow
So,
up to know about the problems after release?
uh, yeah, so I mean, there are so many ways in which one can follow up. And one of the recommendations when we focus on women prisoners and their release is to provide them with some temporary shelter. Because, like I've discussed through the presentation also, very often the women prisoners lose contact with their family, because of various reasons that I discussed, including stigma. That is one. Uh, so following up with them, if they are released, they have nowhere to go, then that does become a little difficult. So there is that need for having some sort of these temporary shelters where they can stay while after their release. Having said that, the stigma is not necessarily after release, but also uh, the fact that a woman has committed a crime versus a man committing a crime. There is also that stigma that is different for a woman and a man. So, say for example, there are so many times when a lot of these women who are convicted for murder are actually cases of domestic violence that just blow up. Uh, there are cases where a woman, say, pushes her husband in self-defense while she's being beaten up, and then he just has an accident and passes away. Uh, so there are I've met women convicted for murder for such cases. So the fact that the woman has killed her husband comes with that added stigma of, how can this woman kill her husband? But uh, nobody would focus on the fact that she was being beaten up when that happened. So there is that different stigma that females have to face when they commit any kind of crime. And that's essentially because our society is also expecting women to be calm, to sort of take whatever is thrown at them in some sense. And women who are inside prison are in some way countering that kind of an expectation that is uh, put on them. So yeah, I mean, I hope that answers your question. If you want me to like go back to it, please.
No, ma'am. Thank you. Participants, do you have any other questions?
Ma'am, how much public money has been spent in prisons, and what are the alternative use of those monies? Money that has been paid.
How much public money? I unfortunately don't have a very specific figure, but you can find the figure in prison statistics that I mentioned about. If you go to the NCRB website, you can find the reports where annually how much money is being spent is shown. Um, yeah, and a really good question. If the public doesn't want to spend that money, we really need to release our under trial prisoners that are in prison. Very often under trial prisoners are people who are marginalized, who can't afford a good lawyer, who can't afford to, like I mentioned, pay for their surety, who don't have sureties or pay for any personal bond. So whenever a bail order is given, a prisoner has to present a surety, which essentially is present people who will say ki they will make sure that person appears during their trial, during whenever the court calls. So a lot of times, people in the prison who are migrants can't find sureties because they, and imagine people migrating into the informal sector who might get caught in some crime, who don't have those resources. So yeah, I mean, the state continues to provide them a shelter, food, etc., etc., and uh, I believe there is a huge prison population that can be released, and prison expenses can be reduced that way.
Thank you, ma'am.
Over to MC.
Thank you for all your interesting and amusing questions. Questions open a space in your mind that allow better answers to breathe.
We are in the last part of this webinar. Vote of thanks. With gratitude is a powerful catalyst for happiness. With that being said, it's time to thank everyone for being a part of this webinar. So I cordially invite Dr. S. Vidya, Assistant Professor, PG and Research Department, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone gathered here. I deem it a great pleasure to propose the vote of thanks. I thank the Almighty for the showerful blessings for the successful completion of this webinar. I thank the management and principal for their motivation, support, and encouragement. I take it a great privilege to thank the resource person, Dr. Shai Shetty, former Senior Research and Engagement Officer, Prison Aid and Action Research, Rajasthan, for her clear explanation and sharing her experience on various projects and researches carried out with the women prisoners and women prison. Thank you, ma'am. It is really an unexplored area for many of us. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful speech, ma'am.
Thank
I
you.
thank Dr. G. Kanaga, Professor and Dean of Alumni Relations, for her motivation and support. I thank Dr. G. Matilda Boneshwari, Head and Associate Professor, Department of Social Work, for her constant support, keen interest, and motivation to carry out the departmental activities. Thank you, ma'am. I thank the organizing secretary, Mrs. Hema, Assistant Professor, for organizing such a wonderful session and giving us a new idea on the particular topic. Thank you, Ms. Hema. I thank the team of staff members, Ms. Rani, Dr. Aisha Manju, Dr. Amrit.
Over to MC.
Thank you, ma'am. That wraps up our program. On behalf of Kaveri College, thank you all for making time in your busy schedules to join us here today. I'd like to bring to you your notice that we have planned another national webinar on sustainable developmental goals, good health and well-being of tribal population in India on 19th August. You're all invited to join this very informational webinar. It's been a pleasure to host this webinar and I wish everyone a pleasant day.